November 17th, 1944. Fog chokes the forests around Huichin. Dawn hasn't broken so much as seeped through the canopy like ash in water. Oberjefreiter Karl Beck listens closely from inside his Panzer V Panther, hatches sealed, engine idling. Rain taps lightly against the hull. At first he thinks it's water dripping from the trees. Then the rhythm shifts. Faster, crisper. Not rain, not wind. Movement. He clicks on the intercom. Sound, left flank, small arms, infantry. No answer yet. The Panther's radios have been unreliable all week. Moisture fouls everything. Static chews through most transmissions. In the silence, something else creeps in, a low, mechanical murmur. Not the growl of one Sherman, but many, coordinated, crawling over the ridge. Beck's breath catches. There shouldn't be Americans this far east, not in this number. Their armor was supposed to be limited to patrols, delays. Then the first shell strikes. Not a direct hit, a ranging shot, but close enough to make every man inside flinch. Lieutenant Fisher shouts from the turret, "Panzer ready, all guns left arc, move, move." Another shot whistles past. This one skips off the right side of the hull with a deafening shriek. Beck slams the Panther into gear. Treads churn into thick mud. The entire forest seems to crack awake with gunfire. He catches sight of them through the periscope. Shermans, not just any. These are faster, lower profile, sharper angles. One blinks through the mist and lets loose another 76 Michel. A shot that wasn't supposed to be possible from a Sherman at this range. "Easy eights," Beck breathes. They had laughed at the M4. Early war Shermans were high, clumsy, undergunned. The Panther was a Predator, thick frontal armor, high-velocity cannon, superior optics. Sherman crews nicknamed it the Panther's prey for a reason. But this was different. From the ridge, more Shermans appear. 8, 10 more. They're fanning out, not charging blindly, coordinating like wolves. The first Panther in Beck's column lurches as a 76 HVAP round punches through the side armor. Not a fluke, not a lucky angle, a deliberate kill. Beck's loader screams, "That was tungsten." They're using high-velocity armor-piercing shells, experimental rounds, limited in supply. Supposed to be rare. Supposed to be hard to deliver to frontline tank units. And yet they're here. The second Panther tries to pivot, exposing its rear quarter. Another shot tears into the engine block. Fire blossoms from the exhaust vents. 2 Panthers, destroyed in less than 60 seconds. From the other side of the forest, Lieutenant Jim Rourke adjusts his binoculars and lowers them slowly. "Keep pressing. Flank right, hit and fade. Don't play heroes," he says, calm as if calling a football play. He taps the turret of his Easy 8. "We're not in France anymore. These are Panthers. We outmaneuver them, not outgun them." The voice from his gunner echoes through the intercom. "Got one tracking us. 6 o'clock. Distance 400 yards. He out-switched to HVAP. He watches through the periscope as the round leaves the barrel. It slams into the Panther's side. Smoke vents through the hatch. Mobility kill. That crew's not going anywhere. Another Sherman swings wide through the trees. Rourke's platoon has rehearsed this maneuver. The Easy 8 wasn't designed just for brute force. It was built for speed, stabilization, and communication. They move like one body. Beck knows what's happening now. He's not just under fire, he's being enveloped. The Shermans aren't probing for weakness. They already know where the Panthers are blind, where they're slow, where they can't turn fast enough in narrow woods. This isn't reckless Allied infantry. This is doctrine, training, mechanized confidence. "Reverse," he shouts. "Get us back through the corridor." The Panther bucks and shudders as it claws backward through the mud. A Sherman emerges between trees. It had been waiting in ambush, using dead leaves to mask its silhouette. It fires. The turret rings with the hit. Not a penetration, but close, too close. They keep moving. It's not a duel anymore, it's a trap. The crew has no idea how many are out there now. Every angle seems covered. And every time they think they've cleared a lane, another Easy 8 appears from the smoke. Fisher's voice cracks. They're not Shermans, not anymore. These are something else. Beck doesn't answer, he knows. He watched the old Shermans burn in Normandy, watched them bounce shells off his Panther's glacis plate. But these new ones are different. Lower, sleeker, faster. Their tracks claw over terrain like water over stone. And they never stop moving. That's what makes them terrifying. In a clearing just beyond the kill zone, Lieutenant Rourke climbs out of the hatch, scanning the woods through the drifting smoke. He sees the crippled Panther burning against a tree line, its crew crawling from the rear hatch under fire. They'll be captured if they survive. Behind Rourke, other Shermans move through like sharks circling, finishing off wounded steel beasts. One of his gunners whistles low. I thought we were the ones supposed to run from Panthers. Rourke doesn't smile, not with Easy 8s, not anymore. Back in the forest, Beck's tank finally lurches to a stop. The engine is gone, electrical's dead. They're blind, deaf, and stationary. Fisher orders the hatches opened. Smoke floods out. Outside, the air is still. For a moment there is no fire, no sound, only the smell of oil and steel and fear. Beck lifts himself halfway through the commander's hatch and stares out at a silent circle of Shermans. 5 of them, positioned like chess pieces, surrounding his Panther. Each one with its barrel pointed directly at him. He locks eyes with one of the commanders, young, American, calm. Then slowly, that Sherman commander gives a single, deliberate nod. A signal. Beck freezes. None of the Shermans fire, they wait. He realizes it's over. Not just the engagement. The era. The forest was still smoldering when the silence broke, not with engines, not with gunfire, with boots. American infantry moved through the undergrowth with practiced caution, carbines up, eyes sharp, scanning for mines, snipers, or last-stand holdouts. The smell of wet pine mingled with scorched steel. Beck sat on the hull of his Panther, arms raised, a shallow cut across his brow from the jolt of the impact. His crew sat beside him, disarmed. None of them spoke. The Shermans hadn't fired, not one. They just stood in formation, barrels lowered now as if to say, we could have, we didn't need to. A young American sergeant approached. His uniform was caked in dirt, helmet tilted back. He looked over the Panther's burned skirt armor, then at the melted vision block. He shook his head, hell of a machine. Beck said nothing. Then the sergeant leaned in and added, not unkindly, too slow for what's coming. What came next wasn't a single battle but a pattern. Panthers, Tigers, Jagdpanzers, it didn't matter. One by one, they were pulled into ambushes they never saw forming. The Easy 8s didn't overpower them in direct confrontation. They didn't have to. They outmaneuvered them. In the hedgerows of the Roer, in the valleys near the Siegfried Line, in the broken villages of the Ardennes, it became a rhythm. Shermans in 3s, sometimes 5s, always moving, always probing for the flank. HVAP in the barrel, radios live, turrets powered by fast traverse motors. Crews that had practiced in sandlots back in Alabama or Ohio now operated like armored phantoms. German crews began to refer to them with a new term, never official but spoken with a kind of hushed contempt, Panzerjägergeister, tank hunter ghosts. East of Stahlberg, Unteroffizier Helmut Kruger sat inside the turret of a Jagdpanther, eyes fixed through the periscope. His loader was chewing a cigarette filter, a nervous habit that had spread through the battalion ever since the November engagement. Contact. Kruger shook his head. No movement, but we're exposed on the right slope. I don't like it. The driver muttered, We've got the gun for them. They come forward, we'll crack them in one. They all knew that was true on paper. The Jagdpanther's 88mm gun could kill a Sherman at over a kilometer, but lately the Shermans didn't give them that luxury. They didn't come forward, they came around. Kruger scanned again. Movement. Not one Sherman. 3, spaced apart, hull down behind a barn wall using the wreckage of a half-track for cover. They didn't fire. Instead, 2 more Shermans peeled left through a side road, sweeping toward the tree line. Then a 6th appeared from the rear, half visible behind shattered brush. It was a textbook encirclement. Before Kruger could call it out, the first HVAP round struck the lower glacis. The weld seam buckled. A second round hit the engine deck. Flames bloomed from the vents. Kruger bilayed out, coughing smoke, the side of his uniform scorched. He never saw the Shermans leave. They were gone before his crew hit the dirt. That same afternoon, a prisoner convoy moved through Aachen. Among them were tankers, not infantry, not rear-line support, but corps armor men. They kept their heads down. One of them, a Feldwebel with a cracked wrist and powder burns along his collar, muttered to no one in particular. "It's not that they're better shots, it's that they know where we'll be before we get there." By December, whispers circulated among surviving crews. The Easy-8 wasn't a new tank, not truly just a refinement. Improved suspension, wider tracks, stabilized gun sight. But those refinements compounded. Where once the Sherman had been mocked, now it was feared. It could stop, shoot, and start again before a Tiger's turret rotated 15 degrees. A Panther caught unaware had 10 seconds to react. The Easy-8 needed 4 to finish the fight. In a depot south of Düren, a briefing was held under blackout conditions. 10 tank commanders, 3 maps, 1 truth none of them wanted to say aloud. "They've stopped fighting like a tank battalion," said Oberstleutnant Mettner, pointing at the trails near Jalenkirchen. "They're fighting like cavalry." The word stung. It meant movement, discipline, flexibility, all the things the German Panzer doctrine had once claimed as its own. Mettner's voice dropped lower. "They're surrounding our machines, that's the tactic now, not kill shots, encirclement, pressure, and then they choose whether you die or surrender." A hand raised. "What's our countermeasure?" Mettner looked around the table. "Don't get caught." In January, the snow came. Ardennes froze solid, tracks carved through the white crust like knives through parchment. Shermans had been modified for winter operations, wider bogies, reinforced suspension, engine heating kits. Panthers, in contrast, struggled with engine starts and frozen gearboxes. And the Easy-8s kept moving. At Bastogne, a Panther platoon tried to flank a group of dug-in GIs supported by Shermans. The snowbanks and tree line gave perfect cover for envelopment. What the Germans didn't know, the Shermans had night fighting drills, not infrared, just coordination, low-light movement, and pure instinct. The first Sherman hit the lead Panther with a flanking shot to the drive sprocket, immobilized. The second Sherman moved in under cover of the tree line. No radio chatter, no spotlight, just tracks over snow and 8 rounds in a magazine that fired with brutal certainty. When the sun rose over Bastogne, 5 Shermans encircled 3 disabled Panthers like wolves watching over a cornered bear. By war's end, the numbers were brutal. Panther losses to Shermans didn't just spike, they flipped. The kill ratio, once 3-to-1 in favor of the Panther in open terrain, reversed in close quarters and urban combat. The Shermans weren't stronger, they weren't heavier, they were simply there, everywhere. And they knew how to move together. The Americans had learned something the Germans had forgotten. The war wasn't just about the machine. It was about the machine in numbers, operated by men who were drilled, rotated, and constantly learning. Easy-8s weren't better tanks. They were the right tanks for that moment, for that terrain. for the kind of war Germany was no longer equipped to fight. The last Panther Beck ever saw was burning near the Rhine, hatches open, guns silent. He sat in a POW camp weeks later, listening to a young American mechanic explaining how Shermans were built in 5 states, shipped by rail and modified in theater. "It's like trucks," the American said, not bragging, just speaking plainly. "We just keep 'em running, and we keep 'em together." Beck stared through the fence at a row of Shermans on a rail car, ready to push deeper into Germany. He didn't see tanks. He saw a tide. And he knew the Panthers, beautiful as they were, had drowned in it. The railroad crossing outside Bonn was little more than a skeleton now, blackened wood, snapped rails, and the twisted carcass of what had once been a freight car. The snow muffled the sounds of war, but didn't erase them. Distant artillery pulsed through the earth like the heartbeat of something ancient and angry. Major Gerhard Voss leaned against the glacis plate of a Jagdtiger and lit a cigarette with numb fingers. He didn't want to be here, not because of the weather, not even because of the enemy, but because of what his orders now looked like. "Delay them," the general had said. "Trade blood for hours, hold the crossings, hold the ridge, let the fatherland breathe." He hadn't mentioned the Easy Eights. He hadn't needed to. The men talked about them now more than they did tigers or bombers or even fuel. Every ambush ended the same way. Every position they tried to hold unraveled under maneuver and fire. The Americans weren't charging anymore. They were circling. The armor engagement at the Bonn crossing was textbook in German doctrine, or what had once been doctrine. 3 Panthers on a ridge, overwatch position, infantry screens on the flanks, interlocking fields of fire with a Jagdtiger positioned to cover retreat. And it should have worked. But the Shermans didn't attack the crossing. They bypassed it. 4 Easy Eights emerged from the tree line to the northeast, coming through terrain that was supposed to be impassable for armor. Snowdrifts over a meter deep. Frozen trenches from last week's artillery barrages. But the Shermans crawled through them like predators. One round hit the rear of the 2nd Panther before the Germans even realized the flank was open. The explosion sent the turret ring flying 10 meters into the snow. A second shot severed the radio mast on the command vehicle. Static filled the headsets. Voss shouted for contact, but his men were already scattering. The ridge was no longer an overwatch point. It was a death trap. The Shermans never stayed in one place. They slid along the banks like ice serpents, firing and shifting, always repositioning. From a tree line 200 meters away, Lieutenant Rourke watched through his scope and counted the seconds between German shots. 5 seconds to rotate, 2 to aim, they're hunting blind. He gave the command to the loader, HVAP center mass. The round left the barrel and buried itself in the lower plate of the Jagdtiger. Armor designed to withstand an 88 bounce crumpled under tungsten at the right angle. After the battle, Rourke's tank sat idling in a small clearing while infantry swept the area. His loader leaned out of the turret, arms trembling. "Didn't think we'd win that one." Rourke didn't answer. He was watching the smoldering wrecks. Beautiful machines, all of them, but they had moved too slow, reacted too slow, turned too slow. Even when they fired, they only bought themselves moments. "Still think the Pershing's the future?" his gunner asked. Rourke nodded slowly. "It's coming, but it's not the rifle, it's the man pulling the trigger. The Garand, the Sherman, we didn't build superweapons. We built just enough, and we built thousands." In Berlin, Generaloberst Heinz Guderian stood before a wall-sized map littered with red arrows and blue counters. The front lines looked less like strategy and more like a hemorrhage. One of his aides whispered the latest report. 5 Panthers destroyed by 76 fire, rear flanks, close range, winter terrain. Guderian rubbed his eyes. They were surrounded again. "Yes, sir." Silence. He had helped write the doctrine the Wehrmacht once used to overrun half of Europe. He had believed in fast armor, in coordination, in overwhelming initiative. Now the Americans had stolen that blueprint and improved it. They had turned their once derided Sherman into a surgeon's blade, precise, fast, unstoppable in formation. And the worst part was, they weren't even celebrating it. They didn't need to. In a captured village outside Remagen, a group of German prisoners huddled in the remains of a stone church, stripped of weapons and warmth. Beck sat near the window, watching the snow drift over the tracks. Somewhere, an American cook unit was boiling coffee. The smell reached into the ruined nave. He turned to the man beside him, a tanker from a different battalion. Tiger crew. You ever hit one, an easy 8? The other man shook his head. Not once, they never gave me the shot. Another pause. They don't fight like we do. Beck smiled grimly. That's because we're still fighting like it's 1940. The other man said nothing. He just stared at the empty altar and the broken stained glass. Weeks later, in the Ruhr pocket, it happened again. A last-ditch German armor thrust tried to break out of encirclement. 9 Panthers, 2 Tigers, backed by hastily repaired Panzer IVs. They rolled fast hard, knowing the roads would be watched but gambling on surprise. The first Sherman didn't fire. It let the column pass. So did the second and the third. Then the fourth Sherman lit up the rear tank, blocking the retreat. The Americans weren't meeting armor head-on anymore. They were letting it pass, then killing it from behind. By the time the column turned, every exit was already covered. Surrounded again. Shermans crept in from both sides, low and silent, engines throttled low to mask their approach. The Germans opened fire but too late and at too many targets. It was like trying to swat mosquitoes with a sledgehammer. 2 tanks were taken out by bazookas. The others simply stopped firing, tracks sheared, vision blocked by smoke grenades. The lead Panther's crew stepped out with white cloth on a stick. The others followed. Rourke walked past the lined-up crews without a word. One German shouted at him in English, "Why didn't you finish us?" He stopped and looked at them. "We didn't need to." Then he walked on. By March, the war was all but over for Germany's armor. Factories had stopped functioning. Fuel was rationed to less than a gallon per tank per day. Crews were teenagers, often trained in simulators made from wooden crates and hand-drawn dials. But still the Shermans came, easy 8s by the hundreds. Each one driven by a kid from Texas or Detroit or Kansas. Each one trained to drive, to shoot, to coordinate. Each one built in a plant where trains left every hour, loaded with parts, men, and doctrine. They didn't fight fair, they didn't fight noble, they fought to win. Back in the prison camp, Beck watched one of the guards clean his rifle. He had spent the last 2 years cleaning his Panther as if it were holy, oiling every bolt, checking every hinge. He had believed in that machine, believed it could hold back the future. He no longer believed that. He watched the Americans, the way they laughed, the way they trained even now, long after the fight had ended. They had figured something out. War wasn't about whose tank was better on paper. It was about who could surround you before you knew you were losing. They had stopped calling them Shermans entirely. By the final weeks of March, among what few tank battalions still remained, the German crews simply said Die-Etched, the 8. Not for the number of them, though the Americans now fielded more armor per front than Germany could hope to match, but for the sound. That rhythmic, unmistakable chain of cannon fire from the M176, 8 shots in quick succession. Then silence. Then another tank. Another 8. Another kill. A dead panther in an orchard outside Castle had VIII scratched into its turret with chalk. No one knew who wrote it. Infantry, tankers, some American with a sense of humor, but the point landed hard. The Easy Eights had become death from every angle. Major Voss took the surrender of his battalion on March 30th. He hadn't planned to surrender, not after 37 combat actions, not after surviving the Eastern Front, not after everything. But what stood between him and retreat was a semicircle of Easy Eights, not firing, just waiting. He had surveyed the field from a barn window. His last 4 Panthers had stalled in wet mud outside of a railway crossing near Fulda. One had taken a track hit from behind, a classic American move now. Let the German tank push forward, let it rotate, then kill the drive. Don't go for the turret. Don't waste time, just cut the legs. The other 3 were sitting still. No fuel, no communications. He had ordered his officers to burn them. By nightfall, the smell of scorched steel hung in the trees like rot, and the Americans still hadn't moved. So Voss walked out, unarmed, uniform pressed, and surrendered. Not one Easy Eight had fired a shot during the surrender. That was the part that haunted him. They didn't need to. In a small American command post 2 kilometers north, Lieutenant Rourke poured black coffee into a tin mug. His tank was parked behind a hedgerow, half covered in camouflage netting. He had run the same tactic a dozen times now. Wait, maneuver. Don't challenge a Panther head-on. Force it to turn. Force it to waste time. Surround it. His platoon hadn't lost a tank in 3 weeks, and they'd destroyed 14 enemy vehicles. The latest had been a Tiger. It had taken 4 of them, perfect timing, a crossfire, and 2 HVAP shells to the side skirt. But the Tiger never fired. The crew had panicked, hesitated, tried to reverse. That moment was all they needed. And it wasn't luck. It was repetition. In Berlin, final orders came down with ink-stained hands. The Waffen-SS armor reserve near Magdeburg was to counterattack and halt the American crossing of the Elbe. They had 14 Panthers, no fuel for a 15th. A few officers whispered doubts, not about the cause but about the odds. Everyone knew the Shermans would be waiting, not just Shermans, the Shermans, Easy Eights. The night before the counterattack, a young gunner scribbled something on the inside of his turret with a graphite pencil. Es ist nicht der Panzer, den wir fürchten, es ist der Kreis. It's not the tank we fear, it's the circle. When the battalion rolled out toward the Elbe, they didn't make it 2 kilometers before contact. 3 Easy Eights appeared on a low ridge to the west, half obscured by smoke. They didn't fire, they waited. A 4th Sherman moved across the flank, barely visible between trees. Then a 5th, barely audible behind them. The Panthers realized it all too late. The Americans weren't reacting, they were guiding, they were pressing the Panthers into a funnel. The Germans opened fire but blindly. Shells cracked trees, tore soil. Then the Easy Eights opened up, not in a storm but in rhythm. Each crew knew their role. Lead Sherman distracted, 2nd flanked, 3rd hit track. It was an execution, not a duel. By April, what remained of the Panzer forces were either in retreat or destroyed. In American records, the engagement west of Magdeburg was noted as brief contact, armored resistance neutralized within 15 minutes. The after-action report included a line that repeated across multiple engagements. Enemy did not coordinate counterflanking. No surviving tanks recovered. No survivors, not because they were all dead, but because the tanks never made it out. The Shermans never let them. At a depot south of Hanover, prisoners were gathered behind a temporary fence. Most were young, too young. One had never fired his tank's main gun before it was hit. An American officer asked one of them, through an interpreter, "Why did your tank stop?" The boy answered simply, "We saw the others die." The translator looked confused. "You didn't see who hit them?" The boy shook his head. "We never saw them, they were just everywhere." After the crossing of the Elbe, the Sherman formations didn't slow. If anything, they accelerated. Bridges repaired, fuel delivered, crews rotated, but the rhythm never broke. It was the doctrine of momentum. Never let the enemy breathe, always move. By then, the Germans knew what would happen. As soon as the engines revved, the outcome was decided. The Panther might kill one, but the Shermans would kill the rest. Back at the American camp near Leipzig, Lieutenant Rourke removed a small photo from his jacket. It was folded, worn at the edges, a crew picture from Louisiana taken 2 years earlier. Smiles, youth, innocence. He looked at his men now, hardened, quiet, older in ways time couldn't measure. The Easy 8 hadn't just carried them across France, it had become their home, their coffin, their salvation. It was loud, cramped, underpowered by German standards, but it kept them alive. And when it moved, when 4 or 5 Shermans surged forward in tandem, flanking, fanning out like wolves, there was no tank in Europe that could stop it. Not even the vaunted Panther. Especially not the Panther. The next morning, word came down. The war was ending. Berlin was surrounded. Surrender was being negotiated. Rourke sat on his tank one last time, coffee cooling beside him. He looked out across the fields, dotted with the burned-out hulks of what once were German armor units. He didn't feel triumph, only relief and something else. Finality. The war had changed. So had the weapons. But more than anything, the way of war had changed. Victory no longer came from the strongest tank. It came from the ones that knew how to surround it. The war didn't end with a bang, not for the tankers. There was no dramatic last stand, no final duel between Panther and Sherman beneath a crimson sky. It ended with radio silence. On May 7, 1945, the orders stopped coming. The tank engines that had rumbled and groaned and smoked across all of Europe went quiet. What fuel remained was drained for generators. What ammunition was left was locked up, not for use, but for surrender. Across the Western Front, armor crews emerged from forests, hillsides, shattered towns blinking in daylight, hands raised, uniforms scorched, eyes hollow. In a field outside Gießen, 5 Panther crews walked toward an American checkpoint with white flags tied to their barrels. Their tanks had not been knocked out. Their guns still worked. Their radios still whispered. But they didn't bother anymore. Because they knew what waited on the other side. A company of Easy 8s, idling in formation, guns cold, engines humming like the beginning of a new century. Major Voss watched it all unfold from the edge of the surrender zone. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat, his holster empty, his heart strangely steady. An American officer approached with a clipboard and a calm face. The man didn't even look up as he gestured toward the line of Panthers. "Are they fueled?" Voss nodded, half loads. The American made a note. "You'll move them to the drop point. Crews stay here, you understand." Voss did. He understood more than that. He understood what the clipboard meant. Logistics, process, the new war. The Americans had not only outmaneuvered Germany, they had outadministered it. His eyes drifted to the Easy 8s in the background, clean lines, slight hull slope, gun barrels resting steady. It was not hatred he felt, not even envy. It was acknowledgement. Rourke stood on the engine deck of his Sherman as the Panthers rolled past. Their tracks squealed. Their drivers refused to make eye contact. One of the German commanders did glance up, a weathered man, face cut by lines of command and failure. They locked eyes. Rourke gave a slow nod. It wasn't victory, it was closure. He'd come ashore in Normandy with 40 pounds of gear, a sidearm he never used, and a brand new tank with a steel smell still fresh. Now the war was over. His tank was scratched, repaired, repainted twice. He knew every inch of it, every quirk in its controls, every note its engine made when pushed too hard uphill. He'd lost men, He'd buried friends. He'd seen Panthers chew through lines like fire. But not at the end. At the end, the Shermans had been the ones surrounding the monsters. Back in the camp, Beck scribbled notes into a pocket journal. The guards didn't mind. Most didn't even notice. He wasn't drawing tanks, not anymore. He was sketching maps, patterns, arrows, movement. He was trying to figure out when the Americans had started winning, not just tactically, strategically, mentally. He flipped back to an earlier page, where he'd written something weeks ago. They don't outgun us. They outnumber, outpace, outlearn. That had been the moment it started to turn. The Americans took photographs of the surrendered Panthers, then loaded them onto trains. Some would be sent back to Aberdeen. Others would be destroyed. Rourke passed one of them, Panther 241, blackened on the rear deck from an engine fire the crew had started themselves. His gunner asked, "Think we'll see it in a museum someday?" Rourke gave a thin smile. If they're honest about what beat it. They kept walking. By summer, the Easy 8s were pulled off frontline service. Some were sent to occupation zones. Others were shipped home. A few were sold to allied nations who couldn't afford Pershings. But in every country they passed through, whispers remained. Not about their firepower. About how they moved, how they hunted, how they always came from the flanks. How they didn't need to fight fair. Because war isn't fair. And because by the time the Panther saw them, the Easy 8s had already surrounded it. In 1946, during an after-action review in a captured German barracks, an American colonel looked at the stacked reports of tank engagements from the Western Front. He tapped a folder and said to a junior officer, "We didn't win because our tanks were better." The officer frowned. "Then why did we win?" The colonel lit a cigarette. "Because our tanks weren't alone." Back in Ohio, Rourke climbed into the cab of a delivery truck. The war was over, but he still preferred to drive something made of steel. He never called it PTSD. He called it remembering. Sometimes at night he'd wake up and still hear the ping of HVAP casings, the smell of burnt cordite, the sound of a Panther engine stalling. He kept a photo in his wallet of his Sherman just before Bastogne, 3 men sitting on the hull. He was the only one who'd made it home. He didn't talk about the war much, but once at a county fair, someone asked him what kind of tank he drove. "Easy 8, he said, quiet. The kid asked, "What was it good at?" Rourke paused, then answered, "Finishing the war." And in a junkyard somewhere outside Dresden, the last Panther of the 9th SS Panzer Division rusted beneath weeds. Its turret was locked at an angle. The crew had welded the hatches shut before abandoning it. On the underside of the barrel, still faint beneath soot and ash, was a scratch made by a Sherman side skirt during one of the last encirclements. A single number etched by contact. 8.